high sign when you think I should get going.
It is, yes, and here it is. Go for it.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Andy Davis. I'm a longtime friend and supporter of New Hampshire Peace Action. Glad to welcome you to another edition of Monday Evening Peace and Justice Conversations. This one is on May 18th, 2026. If you're looking at it in the future, this is what we looked like way back then. We're very happy to have Jonathan Moller, commonly known as Jonás, with us this evening. Ever since the early 80s, New Hampshire Peace Action from our home in New Hampshire has been radiating peace out into the world, promoting a world of cooperation and mutual aid and love across boundaries, as opposed to that other thing that tends to dominate systems. And so we're so grateful that you are all part of it in whatever way. We'd like to start with an acknowledgement that we're doing our work on the traditional ancestral lands of the Abnaki, Pennacook, and Wabnaki people. We honor with gratitude the land and waterways and the people who have been in relationship throughout the generations and throughout the centuries. And we have a quick reminder that we love when you keep your screens on so that when we look out onto the sea of faces, we're actually seeing seas of faces rather than names. But we will keep your audio muted. And when we get to the Q&A, there might be a brief lag from the time I call on you to the time Amy scrambles over and unmutes you. So don't be alarmed. Your beautiful voice will ring out very quickly and we will all hear you. So I'm super excited to introduce Jonás, as I said. Jonás and I first met on a chicken bus in Guatemala in 1994. And I have admired him ever since. He's an example of someone who's able to mobilize his art for advocacy and for justice, always while operating at the highest level. I've admired the work he did from the time when he was focusing almost exclusively on Guatemala through the time when he's branched out to do, in addition to his great books on Guatemala, a book on Peru, one on Cuba, one on people in transit throughout the Americas, which is a project that's come to fruition in the last year that he actually started when he didn't know that it was a project, but he was just taking pictures of people traveling back in the 1980s. His current project is a book on Colombia featuring photographs that he's been taking ever since around 2007. In addition to us being able to enjoy them through his books, you could also enjoy them in such places as the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Reina Sofia in Madrid, the Museo de Bellas Artes in Buenos Aires, and places throughout the Americas. I'll just leave it at that because we have a limited time with our honored guest. So please join me in whatever loud or quiet way you have at your disposal in giving it up for Jonás Moller.
Thank you very much, Andy, and also Amy and Doreen. I'm a photographer and human rights activist, and I First got involved in this work when I was in art school in Boston. I grew up in that area, and I'm based in Denver now. I first got involved, in the mid to late 80s, and I was involved with an organization working in solidarity with El Salvador. And I went to El Salvador in early 93, well, first to Nicaragua in 91, and then from El Salvador to Guatemala in early 93. And in Guatemala, I spent 6+ years, most of those years working with a US-based solidarity organization. Can everybody hear me? Yep. Okay. You can start with the photographs if you want, Amy, because there's quite a few. I worked with a US-based solidarity organization that had an office in the center of Guatemala City, and it was called NCOR, the National Coordinating Office on Refugees and Displaced of Guatemala. And we started an accompaniment project because at-risk displaced communities and return refugee communities were requesting accompaniers to accompany them in their communities as human rights monitors and so on and so forth. At the end of in 2000 and 2001, for a year, I worked with the forensic anthropology team of the Office of Peace and Reconciliation in Quiché, Guatemala. And first, we're going to start with photographs in the communities of population and resistance of the Sierra, which is where I first went in 93. Between 93 and 95, I was in the communities of population and resistance of the Sierra, and then the communities of population and resistance, CPR, of the Ishkan, and then in early 95, the popular communities and resistance in the Petén. And up into the Sierra, these first photographs, these were internally displaced communities. There were over 200,000 people that were displaced in Guatemala. This is a community health promoter looking at a little baby. And there were 45,000 official refugees in Mexico and quite a few other people who fled to Mexico as well. And then these people who were in the mountains in Guatemala in the CPR of the Sierra, these first photographs, it was about a 2-day walk up into the mountains. And they were people that were displaced during massacres and disappearances and all the violence that occurred in the early and mid 1980s. And they fled into the mountains and they slowly came back together. They came together and they formed these communities in resistance. This man is holding a cross that lists the 7 family members that were killed, his 7 family members, and all the crosses behind him, all people that were killed and massacred. There were over 200,000 people that were killed during the 36-year internal armed conflict in Guatemala. It was basically between 1960 and when the peace accords were signed in the end of 1996. Now we go to the jungle area and the CPR of the Ishkan, where I went for their salida al claro. They're coming out into the open and declaring themselves as internally displaced communities. This guy is in the photograph before that is, and then we go into the CPR of the Petén, where I went with my friend Chico in early 95. We were the first international people to visit that, first outsiders really to visit those communities in the jungle in the Petén area in northeast Guatemala. So, I'll talk a little bit about the recent history of Guatemala as well, but we'll go through these photographs. We're still in the popular communities and resistance of the Petén, internally displaced communities. And there were guerrilla fighters that came into the communities when we were there and, took off their uniforms, like this guy right here who's washing laundry. He was a guerrilla fighter. This was, just about 2 years before the signing of the peace accords. This is one of the first photographs I took in Guatemala. It's in San Juan Cotzal. It says they gave their lives like Jesus, and all the crosses have names of people that were killed or massacred in a church. And then a little bit of the exhumations with the Office of Peace and Reconciliation in 2000 and 2001. And that was in the municipality of Neba, which was one of the hardest hit areas, basically in the 1980s. The Shield Triangle, as the Army called them. And, I was shooting black and white photographs sporadically and also color photographs sometimes. And worked with this team for a year, analyzing the remains. This was Army Day in 1996, a few months before the signing of the peace accords. Guatemala experienced, this is the dedication of a monument to the Rio Negro massacre in Rabinal and a Mayan ceremony in front of the monument where 170 women and children were killed in 1982 or 83. And these are resettlement communities of people of the CPR of the Sierra. Basically, the community, the houses behind them, they returned from the mountains and they lived in different places in Guatemala after the signing of the peace accords, which was on December 29th, 1996. This is a resettlement community of the CPR of the Sierra on the south coast. And the first day of classes in the school before they had an actual schoolhouse and a roof and so on. And building one of the first houses in Primavera del Ixcan, which is the primary resettlement community for the CPRs of the Ixcan. Guatemala experienced some of the worst violence in all of Latin America. I mean, for the size of the country as well. And in 1996, I believe it was, Amnesty International declared that there were over 90,000 people disappeared in all of Latin America, and half of them in Guatemala. I mean, there were officially 45,000 people that were disappeared as they were never seen again. Basically, they were killed, they were taken and killed, something like that. More photographs of the exhumations. Two sisters, yeah, we can keep going. I want to read you guys one thing that when I was in the CPR of the Pit-10 in early 1995, one of the leaders there told me this. First, we resist the army, we resist violent death, then we endure hunger and sickness and cold and rain. But even if all that disappears, we continue to resist poverty, injustice, discrimination, and marginalization. We resist a system in a world where power and wealth are concentrated in the hands of a few, and the majority becomes more marginalized and poorer every day. This struggle is not just our struggle, it is your struggle too. 2021 in Neba, and one of the communities, Hanlai, where there are 15 people that we exhumed were killed, that we exhumed, their remains were going to the village cemetery to be reburied. And this is the night before the signing of the peace accords. Long live the peace, it says. Que viva la paz. And the morning of the signing of the peace accords, today, peace is signed on the main daily newspaper, Prensa Libre. And this was in the year 2000. If you can just go back for a second. One photograph.
It is really not. Oh, there, it worked.
Yeah, this photograph. The man on the left, Alfonso Portillo, was elected president, and the man in the middle is Efraín Ríos Montt. He was a dictator, military dictator in 1981 and 82, or 82 into 83. And that was the worst time of the violence, actually. I mean, there was violence in the 60s, violence in the 70s, certainly, and later in the 80s as well. You can continue. Thank you. And these are patrulleros de autodefensa civil. This is the parish house in Neba, where in 2002, where all the records from the exhumations were stored, and it was all burned. And these are color photographs of the exhumations. When I drove up from Guatemala to Denver in 2001, I created an exhibition of these color photographs of the exhumations and the related processes. And it was sponsored by Amnesty International in the USA, and it traveled to different universities that had Amnesty clubs and so on and so forth, a bunch of different places here in the US. And then Amnesty International in Switzerland decided to do a duplicate exhibition, and it toured to several countries in Europe. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and so on, and about the Truth Commission, the Historical Clarification Commission in Guatemala, which released its report in 1999. As I said, there were over 200, I mean, close to 250,000 people that were killed and massacred in Guatemala, and almost all of them civilians. This is in 2015, and the beginning of a trial against ex-General Rios Montt, who committed genocide, essentially. That's his photograph there. I mean, that's a drawing of his face on the glass door. So the Truth Commission, now we're jumping to January 2024, actually. And these photographs are in my new book, Resist to Live, Truth and Justice in Guatemala, which came out this past October. And I'll mention, I mean, with 5 of the 7 books I have out now with sales, I'm supporting organizations that are working for justice and historical memory. So this is outside the public ministry where the Attorney General's office was and so on. It was a very corrupt woman. She was just got out of office, actually. And a new man was supposed to become president in January 2024, and he did, but it was delayed for like almost a day. Bernardo Arevalo, there were protests all around the country for like 3 months because they were attempting to block him from becoming president because it was anti-corruption candidate and also somewhat progressive. And he was the son of the first democratically elected president during the so-called springtime in Guatemala between 1944 and 1954. His father was elected in 1946. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what the Truth Commission, this is in the Central Plaza, the Parque Central, the Central Park in Guatemala City, where the cathedral is and the National Palace is, and people filled the Central Park waiting for the president to appear. He was supposed to appear at like 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and he did not come to speak to the people until 1 or 2 in the morning the following day. I mean, these are people that came from all over the country supporting him. There was a last-minute effort to block him from corrupt Congress people, and people marched from the Central Park to the Congress just a few blocks away to protest. And I have some photographs coming up of that as well. So I'm just going to read you a little bit of what the Commission for Historical Clarification, or the Truth Commission, said. They found that the state and the army and their proxies to be responsible for 93% of the deaths in human rights violations, disappearances, and so on. And only 3% was assigned to the guerrillas. The Truth Commission also concluded the United States trained, aided, and advised the Guatemalan military during the years of the Civil War and the genocidal scorched earth campaigns directed at civilian populations, and with knowledge of the atrocities being carried out by the military state. And one of the things that the Truth Commission found was that acts of genocide occurred in Guatemala in certain regions in 1982 to 1985. I mean, it's, as far as I know, the only country in Latin America where genocide has occurred during recent times. I'm going to read a quote about genocide that's from an office, a legal human rights office in Guatemala City, Caldeache. Genocide, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. This says, against hunger, we all construct justice. What the word genocide does not convey are the cries. What the word does not explain are the lost eyes of the orphans. What the word cannot express are the years of hiding. What the word cannot list is the number of endless nightmares. What the word, that's President Bernardo Arevalo. I met with him in January 2025. And it's a funny story. I mean, it was kind of an informal meeting. He's a nice guy, but they wouldn't let me take a camera or my phone into the office. So at one point I asked him, I said, Mr. President, I was thinking about taking a photograph of you and maybe putting it in my new book. And he said, oh, I can lend you my cell phone. I have an iPhone or a Samsung. Anyways, so just to continue this quote from this poster in the Caldeache office, these are the last few photographs, actually. And then there's photographs of my books. What the word, yes, again, what the word cannot list is the number of endless nightmares. What the word can never foresee is how the smiles of the girls who were massacred would be to be surrounded by the children they never had. That's it. So yeah, these are just older photographs that are kind of ending. And then there's a couple photographs of my books. How are we doing for time? 5 more minutes? Corn and beans in the Chapatul area of the communities of population and resistance of the Sierra. And a boy with a machete in the Petén and the popular communities and resistance of the Petén. I'm actually going back to Guatemala on May 28th for about 2.5 weeks. This was my first book that came out in 2004, Our Cultures, Our Resistance, Repression, Refuge, and Healing in Guatemala, and a Spanish language edition. And with this book, with half of what I've earned from sales since 2004 and half of what I've gotten from honorariums from talks and exhibitions and so on and so forth, I've donated money to the Association for Justice and Reconciliation in Guatemala, which is a group of about 100 people from different communities that are survivors of the massacres and the genocide, who've came together in, I guess it was around 2001 or so, to form this group and they have served as witnesses in cases. They were working with the Center for Legal Rights Human Action, CALDH, witnesses in cases against ex-military officials and generals. That's the Spanish language edition. And this was an idea I had to do an educational book for Guatemala to help recover the historical memory. This just in Spanish. It was done by a publisher in Guatemala. And it also includes photographs by another North American photographer and activist, Daryl Bassey, who you might know, Andy. And he was there in the 80s. And then a group created this educational guide, which is like a magazine with lessons in it and to orient teachers to use the book in classrooms and so on. And that project went on for about 7 years or so. And a CD version as well. That book was published in 2009. This is distribution of books to public schools in Solola. And also an informal exhibition of photographs that traveled around to different schools. In Quiché. And in the Landivar University, using the book in the classrooms and the teacher's guide. And a little boy in the CPR Sierra in a school. So that's the last photograph, actually.
So shall we go straight to Q&A? Are you open to some questions, Jonás?
Sure.
So we can do it the old-fashioned way. You can wave your actual physical hand, or your little hand that you find under React underneath. So why don't we start with Chris Hansen? He's the first hand I see.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Jonás, I'm so glad to see you.
Hi.
I believe that my understanding of some of the books you've written is that they are meant to be provided to the school system in Guatemala to help fulfill part of the government's commitment to a full inclusion of the history of the armed conflict and of the treatment of the indigenous Mayan people by the government during the years of the armed conflict. That your books were intended to help provide that information to school systems. Is that correct?
Yes, but I mean, primarily the educational book in Spanish in Guatemala, right, to recover the historical memory of the violence and the internal armed conflict. But also, I mean, I distributed many copies in Spanish of my first Guatemala book. And I'm distributing quite a few copies of my new Guatemala book in Guatemala as well to communities and organizations and so on and so forth to help recover the historical memory of what happened. And I've given numerous talks and had numerous exhibitions here in the US, in a variety of Latin American countries, memory museums in Guatemala and Chile and Peru and Argentina and so on and so forth, about the recent history of Guatemala and about my work there, as I've given here. So yes. And my new Colombia book actually is going to be the title is probably going to be Colombia, Peace and Justice. And with sales of that book donating to one or two organizations working with disappeared people and for human rights in Colombia.
Okay, thanks, Jonás. On to John. There's a bit of a lag while Amy unmutes you.
Actually, you have to respond. Is it letting you, John? There you go.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for the work that you've done and your photographs. is very powerful. I was wondering if could you elaborate a little bit on what was the source of the conflict that gave rise to all of this killing and genocide and stuff? I mean, presumably, folks were living together down there without it, and then it started. What gave rise to it?
Well, I mean, I'll start a little earlier. In 1954, the second president during what was called the springtime, because they were doing reforms in Guatemala between 1944 and 54, Jacobo Arbenz was the second president during that time. And the United Fruit Company, I don't know if any of you have heard of the United Fruit Company, you know, had a lot of land in Guatemala, growing bananas and so on and so forth. And but they were not working on certain lands. So Audubon's decided to, buy some of that land for cheap prices and give it to poor people and indigenous people and so on and so forth. And then the CIA organized a coup against him, right?
Hmm.
Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles, State Department and the CIA. And after that, there were military governments and, guerrilla groups started to organize maybe in the late 50s. I'm not certain about that. I mean, they basically formed the first guerrilla group in 1960 or 61. And then there were 4 different guerrilla groups, and they came together like in the 80s or early 90s, I'm not sure when, to form the United Revolutionary National Guatemala Front or whatever it's called. But it was because of the military governments, because of the repression that was occurring between, in the late 50s and the early 60s, and the guerrilla groups formed, and they didn't, as I said, the Truth Commission said they only committed 3% of the deaths or the human rights violations and so on and so forth. But there was major repression that occurred first in the 60s, later in the 70s, and mostly in the early 80s. I mean, this military government of Efraín Ríos Montt, the ex-general, he created what was called a scorched earth policy. I mean, they basically wiped out 440 communities or something like that, if I remember correctly, in the early 80s. I mean, there's certainly been people, I mean, I gave a presentation. I've given a couple of presentations where there's been Guatemalans there who were in favor of the military, who disagreed with everything I said. Basically, I gave a presentation once in South Denver here years ago. But yeah, I hope I answered your question a little bit.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go to a question in the chat from Len in Hanover. What can you tell us about the current president's ability to reestablish democratic practices in the country?
The current president, Bernardo Arevalo, well, since he came into office in January of 2024, he hasn't been able to do much because the corrupt attorney general has been bringing Trump charges against him, and other corrupt judges and congresspeople and so on and so forth. But they have new elections. I mean, they just were able to very recently take out the attorney general who was very corrupt, very against him, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, he hasn't been able to do that much, but he's been in solidarity. It's, some people are kind of against him now because he hasn't been able to do that much, but he's a decent man, and I think he's trying to do good work and so on. I mean, I was in Guatemala in January. In early February, I gave a presentation of my new Guatemala book in the Casa de la Memoria, which is part of Caldeache. And I met with the president again briefly to give him a couple of copies of the book, since he wrote a little blurb that's in with his photograph. And I don't know if you ever, Andy, if you ever knew Beatriz Gallardo.
Don't think so.
No, she was an activist. She worked with, Pamela Yates with her films and a couple other people. And I met her like 12 years ago or so, and it ends up she was working in the governmental office, in the presidential office with Bernardo Arevalo.
Oh, wow.
That's how I got in touch, to get him to write a little blurb. And he talked a little bit about, the protests and all the people in the Parque Central supporting him. But there's still, there's still corruption, there's still violence, and so on and so forth.
Okay, on to Mike.
Yeah, my question deals with the indigenous hatred between the right and the left in many of these Latin American countries. So, as have watched different films and read different books, it seems like there's a genuine hatred between those who have ancestors among the Spanish ruling classes and the peasantry. That it's not all CIA and or US aid or North American involvement. Not that that doesn't make it easier to do, but there's this genuine hatred that people like in Argentina in the 70s had towards those on the left, and I think they disappeared over 3,000 people, and the same thing under Pinochet. So my question gets back to a documentary I saw dealing with Guatemala and Iran, and it was an interview by John Chancellor in 1965 called The Science of Spying. And they were talking about the CIA's involvement. And at the time, Dulles was saying, oh, yeah, we did that, because he was very proud of overthrowing both Mossadegh in Iran and then Arbenz in Guatemala. And then John Chancellor goes up in the hills with one of the guerrilla resistors, and they're showing what they did and what they destroyed. But what I'm trying to figure out in my own mind is, we want to blame the CIA, but I think in some ways, according to what I've been able to tell, the CIA was trying to brag about what they were doing for more funding. So they wanted to look like they were orchestrating the mass murder. Not that they weren't, but they tried to inflate the mass murder or whatever it is that they were facilitating. And I'm wondering if that can also be seen in Guatemala, because it seems to me when you get to Rios Montt in the 80s and they're killing the Mayans, they just wanted to kill Mayans. I mean, Mayans were different. They weren't integrated into the Guatemalan city society. And apparently there was a lot of resentment and they just wanted to go out and kill people, regardless of whether the CIA would have thought it was a good idea. So I'm curious what you think about.
Yes, I mean there were many, many massacres, many disappeared people, many, many, many people killed. I mean, I don't know if the CIA was involved in later years or not, but I mean, I can say one thing. When Rios Montt was president, okay, Ronald Reagan was president, or shortly after that, and he called Rios Montt a great patriot. And another thing to mention also is that Israel sent arms to Guatemala in the 80s and maybe later. I mean, Guatemala has one of the largest indigenous populations in the Americas. It's diminished somewhat as younger people are changing and not speaking the 21 or 22 different Mayan languages. But so it is. I mean, there's still many, 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 many indigenous people in all parts of Guatemala, including in Guatemala City now. But I'm going back there on May 28th to distribute more copies of my new book, my new Guatemala book in Spanish. And I'll be going to Neiba. I'll be going to Mazatenango, Neiba, where Sebastian Seto wrote a short text for the book and giving a few books there, and then to Tenango and other places. I'm sorry, did I answer your question correctly, or?
I would say sufficiently, Jonás. It's a very complicated question, and why don't we keep on, go on to Moji. I hope I am pronouncing your name correctly.
We can't hear you, Moji.
Is that him in the upper?
Yes.
Yeah, Moji, you might need to use a chat. There seems to be something wrong with your audio.
How about now?
There you go.
Moji.
Okay. Okay. First of all, thank you for your presentation. I am from Iran.
You're from
I
Iran? Okay.
Yeah, I live in Boulder, Colorado, and I am a Mossadeghi.
Oh, you're in Boulder, Colorado? Yes, I'm in
Yes.
Denver. Maybe
Good, we can meet.
yes, maybe
hopefully.
we can meet sometime. It's terrible
And
what's
my
happening.
question,
Yes.
thank you. I'll
Go
put some information in the chat. The question I wanted to ask, you began answering by saying Israel sent some arms to the coup government, or
Yeah.
and I am wondering about, so that's my question, and then I have a comment regarding what Mike said, that so I am wondering to what extent Israel, especially under Netanyahu, is covertly and overtly trying to destabilize any movement toward democracy in Guatemala. And so if you could address that. But as far as the question of there are in indigenous communities or in global South communities, there are differences, there are tensions, and colonialism, however, comes and takes advantage of these and does divide and conquer in order to then blame, to say, oh, the CIA didn't do the killing. They were looking to kill each other or to kill the Mayans, as you said. So this is something that is very important to understand. The global North, under the, what leftists, I am a social democrat, what leftists called imperialism and Zionism, and colonialism, the proper term in my frame of reference, is they exploit and exacerbate and weaponize natural differences that exist in societies of the global South in order to then say, oh, they were killing each other anyhow, and we were not that complicit in genocide. And Israel has been doing this, has been weaponizing this kind of rhetoric, this kind of narrative, in order to say the Palestinians and the Muslims are savages and they kill each other, and we are just a little neighborhood here, and we are trying to defend ourselves. So if you could talk about Israel's role in Guatemala, I would appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for talking. Yes, thank you for your questions and so on, and your comments. I don't know if Netanyahu is involved in Guatemala these days. I mean, I'm certainly against him and what's going on in Palestine. But I do know that Israel, and I'm not sure if it was in the 80s, I think it was, through the United States probably, or with the United States request, was supporting the Guatemalan military with weapons and maybe some aid as well. And as I mentioned before, the United States in the 1980s was supporting the Guatemalan military in their genocide and massacres against indigenous populations. I mean, some of the indigenous people certainly in some areas were supporting the guerrillas because of the military governments, not, I mean, supporting them from their, not with the weapons or anything like that, but I know people that are ex-guerrillas. I ran into guerrilla fighters when I was walking up into the mountains, into the CPR Sierra and walking down as well. And they were nice people, relatively. But yeah, I mean, it was.
Jonás, could I take one pass at the Israel question? Um, I don't have details in terms of dates and so forth about the way it was used, but definitely there was a period during the worst years of the violence in the early 1980s when what the Guatemalan military was doing was even a bad look for the Reagan administration. So U.S. aid to Guatemala was briefly cut off, and during that time,
During the, yeah, during
and
the
during
Carter
that time,
government.
Israel began being used as a back channel. Basically, the U.S. was still supporting the worst of what was happening in Guatemala, but they chose to do it through the Israelis.
Yes, true. Well said, Andy.
So, did you have more to say about Moji's question, or I have a question from the chat, and then I would go back to Chris if you want to keep progressing.
No, I don't. I unfortunately don't have more to say to Moji, but thank you, Moji.
Okay, so Amy in the chat says, how do the people of Guatemala feel about the US now?
Well, I mean, there's, as from other countries as well, there's been many, many Guatemalans that have come to the US to work and better their lives and so on and so forth before this current administration here in the Estados Perdidos or Estados Jodidos. Yes, as I say to people in Spanish often. But I mean, certainly there's certainly quite a few Guatemalans in Guatemala who realized that the U.S. supported the military during the worst years of violence, the scorched earth policy under Rios Montt, the massacres that occurred, numerous massacres of women and children and elderly people and men as well. But yeah. And Andy, if you want to, I can send you a PDF of my book if you want.
Thank you. All right, let's go back to Chris Hansen. And I think we're in about the final 5 minutes before we move on to announcements and so forth and start to wrap it up. It's amazing how quickly these hours go by.
Yes, it is. Did I do okay with my presentation?
Absolutely. Let's hear from Chris. Did he do okay, Chris?
I think you're doing great, Jonás. Thank you so much.
Okay,
And
thank you.
I'm very happy that you've addressed some of the questions about the connections with the Israel and what has happened, what was happening in the 80s and 90s, especially with it connected to Israel. But I'm wondering if the parallels, if there's any further documentation or if you know where we might look for it. I think I've read hints that Israeli forces or Israeli soldiers provided some of the training for the Guatemalan military.
I believe that's true as well. I believe that's true. That rings a bell.
It was really jarring to hear you describing what was happening to the Guatemalan people in terms of people having to flee into the mountains or hiding in the mountains and in the jungles, and also being displaced. And so much of the words of your description, will fit perfectly with descriptions of what's been happening in Gaza for the last 2.5 years.
Yes, yes,
And the indiscriminate targeting of civilians, men, women, and children, whether combatants or not, seems really characteristic of what happened in Guatemala and also what's happened between the United States forces and the indigenous peoples of this continent during the years of settlement and expansion and so on.
yes.
But the the parallels with what the Israeli forces have done and the Israeli policies have been are so jarring that I just wonder if there's more corroboration of any of that we could find.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean that's a good point. But and I previously thought about going to Palestine to take photographs, but I'd never been to that part of the world. And I have photographs of quite a few protests, and I considered doing another book with many photographs from protests. But I don't know. I mean, basically, since my first two Guatemala books came out in 2004 and 2009, I've had to pay for all my books. I mean, for the production, the design, and the printing with a publisher in Spain that's doing both English and Spanish language editions of all my books. Thankfully, due to an inheritance I received in 2009.
Have you or would you put in the chat a way that people can be in touch with you to buy your books? Is that a possibility?
Yes, I mean I've I have boxes and boxes of books here in Denver, and people are buying less books certainly, but you can see it on my website.
Oh,
Uh,
okay,
yeah, that Amy just put the website up there about my books and what I do with some of them.
good. Well, I
Yeah.
have copies of I think 2 or 3 of your books, and
Oh, do
I show
you?
them around whenever we're talking about human rights anywhere. It's very, very helpful to show your work. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Where are you based? In New Hampshire?
I'm still in New Hampshire
Yes.
after all these years. Yeah,
Yes.
probably where I last saw you at the World Fellowship, I think.
Oh, yeah, I did a couple of presentations there. Yes, you
Yeah,
probably saw me there.
yeah.
Yeah.
There are a couple more questions in the chat, Andy, if you want to try to squeeze those in. We
Yeah,
have
I
about
was noticing your tiny little question, Amy. Let's see. All right, so the two questions I'm seeing uh, are from Evan. Did the Truth Commission, I'm going to lump them together. Did the Truth Commission ever name Reagan or US CIA directly in their reports? And then Amy finishes up with a helpful, tiny little question. What do you think about current US policy and actions in Latin America?
I'm not at all in favor of current US policies in Latin America at all. I mean, the president of Argentina, Milei, is a very right-wing guy, and he's a friend of Trump's, basically, and also Bukele in El Salvador. But I mean, he's pressured different governments and and been involved in different elections, like in Honduras and so on. And probably in Colombia, there's going to be elections on May 31st. And there's a left-wing candidate, Ivan Cepeda, who's been leading in the polls, but he may not win because of Trump. Who knows? Yeah, I mean, it's really hard. I mean, and the project I did in Cuba about the diversity of young Cubans really doesn't have anything to do with human rights, but not much, but it has to do with the human rights of, the diversity of young people in Cuba in some way. And I've had 3 or 4 exhibitions in Cuba, in Havana. And the exhibition I had of the young Cuba photographs was actually censored. They didn't want any photographs of people in long lines, people looking poor, people looking bored, that kind of thing.
Did you have an answer about whether Reagan or the CIA were mentioned in the Truth Commission report?
I don't know, actually. I don't know for sure. I mean, I have the books of the Truth Commission, but I haven't read them all. But they did say that the US was involved in supporting and they had knowledge of the massacres and the disappearances and so on and so forth in Guatemala in the 80s. I don't know if they mentioned Reagan or the CIA. They probably mentioned the CIA. The Truth Commission report is called Guatemala Never Again in English. And there was actually a prior Truth Commission done by the Archbishop's Human Rights Office in Guatemala City. And there was a bishop who was the head of that, Bishop Juan Gerardi. And when they released the report, 4 days later, he was killed.
So, Jonás, I'd rather not end with the killing of Monsignor Gerardi. Do you have any final word you'd like to say before we move on to announcements?
Well, as I said, I'm going back to Guatemala on May 28th, and I'm going to distribute quite a few books. I had my publisher in Spain send 81 copies in Spanish to Guatemala, primarily some to sell, and all the money goes to the Center for Human Rights Legal Action and the House of Memory. And thank you, somebody's saying. And I'll be distributing books to authors that wrote short texts, because I didn't have too many books when I was there in the end of January. And going to places in the country where I haven't been in quite a few years, actually. We'll see.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Jonás, for traveling virtually to be with us in New Hampshire again. And thank you for all you continue to do. And we also thank everyone who tuned in this evening for participating in Peace Action. And also, Peace Action is able to offer these programs free of charge. But it doesn't mean that Peace Action doesn't need your generous donations. So please continue supporting the good work, New Hampshire.
Thank you very much, Andy. And somebody just a question popped up on the bottom of the screen saying, is United Fruit still involved in Guatemala? No, United Fruit doesn't exist anymore. Since quite a few years ago. Correct?
Yeah, it got wrapped up in other brands.
Yes.
But we do try to end on time. So I'm going to pass the word to Amy for any final announcements.
Okay. And thank you very much, Amy.
Yeah, thank you. I feel it's important to understand some of the history that's gone on, particularly as this upsurge in U.S. violence towards folks in Latin America.
Yes.
And the continuing threats, to understand that these are folks who've already suffered under terrible regimes and often with U.S. involvement, and to see that we keep an eye on that so we don't repeat that, and that we honor the humanity of all these folks that you took all those beautiful
Hopefully
pictures.
we do not repeat that. I mean, I've done some presentations that are mostly Guatemala, but combined with Peru. The project I did in Peru was with the Peruvian forensic anthropology team, but it was mostly with their area of memory. And we were interviewing and photographing people that lost family members during the armed conflict in Peru, up in the Andes and also down in the coastal area as well. I didn't live there, but over the course of 8 years, I went. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for all that work. Let me just say a few things about upcoming programs here. If you are in person, here in New Hampshire, in the area, our vigils for a just peace in the Middle East continue. Wednesday, May 20th, 2 to 3 p.m. will be near Representative Pappas's office on 3rd Street in Dover, New Hampshire. Thursday, May 21st, folks will gather from noon to 1 at City Plaza in Concord. Then Wednesday, May 27th, 2 to 3, we're outside of Senator Shaheen's office, 340 Central Ave in Dover. This coming Wednesday, going to some online things, this Wednesday, May 20th, 7 p.m. on Zoom, join us for the New Hampshire Coalition for a Just Peace in the Middle East quarterly update, where we'll highlight what the coalition and some member groups are doing, let you know what's going on and where we could use more help and how folks can get more involved. Our next Peace and Justice conversation via Zoom is Monday, June 1st, 7 p.m. And that time we are going to focus on current U.S. policy in Cuba. There'll be some review of the history, but also with an eye towards the potential for a change maybe for the better in U.S.-Cuban relations. Lots of folks have been working hard on that. On Monday, June 15th, 7 p.m., we'll be back here again, and we will be talking about paths to peace with Iran, with Moji, our good friend. And again, if you're here in New Hampshire, one more thing to flag, Sunday, June 28th, noon to 4 p.m. is our annual meeting of New Hampshire Peace Action at Bear Brook State Park. I think it's Allenstown. And we'll tell you about our work. We'll hear your thoughts. We have a potluck luncheon. We expect to be meeting some pro-peace candidates that day. And we'll be led in Songs of Resistance by our friend Bob Moore. So I'm going to hand it back to Andy to say a final good night.
Thank you, Amy. And I would just like to thank you, Jonás, again for being patient with our very compressed format. But we certainly seeing many of those photos again is just moving and inspiring. So thank you for bringing them to us. And thank you for everybody for being part of what Peace Action does. And see you at some of those upcoming events.
Thanks, everybody.
Evening.